Many people pray every day, yet inside they feel empty, confused, and tired. They speak words, but they do not feel God's presence. They kneel, they fold their hands, they close their eyes, but their hearts remain restless. This is because prayer is not a ritual we perform. It is a relationship we must learn. Prayer is not about speaking many words to impress God. God is not moved by the length of our prayers, but by the sincerity of our faith. When prayer becomes real, it changes the atmosphere around us. Fear begins to lose its grip. Anxiety slowly fades away. The heart finds peace even before the answer comes. True prayer is not shouting in desperation. It is trusting in quiet confidence. It is placing your burdens into God's hands and believing that He is already at work, even when you cannot see it. Many believers ask, "Why does God not answer my prayers?" But the real question is, do I know how to pray according to God's will? Prayer is not forcing heaven to obey us. It is aligning our hearts with heaven. When our spirit is aligned with God's purpose, prayer becomes powerful, it becomes effective, it becomes life-giving. Prayer is learned in silence, in humility, and in surrender. It begins when we stop trying to control everything and start trusting God with everything. When you truly learn how to pray, you do not come to God only for blessings. You come to Him for transformation. And once prayer transforms you, your circumstances will never remain the same. Many people believe prayer is something they must perform every day, a duty to complete or a routine to follow. They think prayer begins when they bow their head and ends when they say the last word. But prayer was never meant to be a habit without heart. Prayer was designed by God as a living relationship between Him and His children. A ritual can be repeated without thought, but a relationship requires presence, honesty, and faith. When prayer becomes only a routine, the heart slowly disconnects. Words are spoken, but the spirit remains silent. Lips move, but the soul feels distant. This is why many pray faithfully and still feel empty. They are practicing prayer, but not experiencing God. God never asked for perfect sentences or polished expressions. He desires a sincere heart that comes close to Him with trust and openness. In a true relationship, communication flows naturally. You do not speak to someone you love with fear or formality. You speak with confidence, knowing you are heard. Prayer works the same way. God invites His children to come boldly, not as strangers, but as sons and daughters. When prayer becomes relational, it is no longer about saying the right words, but about sharing the real condition of the heart. A ritual depends on repetition. A relationship depends on connection. Rituals can continue even when faith is weak, but relationship grows only when faith is alive. God responds to faith, not formulas. He listens to the cry of the heart more than the sound of the voice. When prayer is relational, even silence has meaning because the heart is aware of God's presence. Many people stop praying when they do not see immediate answers. This happens because they treat prayer as a transaction instead of a relationship. In relationships, trust grows even when answers are delayed. A child does not stop speaking to a parent because a request is not fulfilled immediately. The bond itself gives assurance. Prayer changes when we understand that God is not distant, but near, attentive, and involved in our daily lives. Relational prayer transforms how we approach God. We no longer come only with requests, but with gratitude, humility, and surrender. We speak and we also listen. We allow God to shape our thoughts, correct our desires, and calm our fears. Prayer becomes a meeting place where the human heart and divine will come together. When prayer is a relationship, it extends beyond words and moments. It becomes part of daily life. A quiet thought becomes a prayer. A deep breath becomes trust. A tear becomes communication. God is no longer someone we visit briefly, but someone we walk with continuously. This kind of prayer strengthens faith even in difficult times because the believer knows they are not alone. Ritual-based prayer seeks results. Relationship Faith-based prayer seeks closeness. Results follow naturally when closeness is established. The more we know God, the more our prayers align with His will. Our desires change. Our priorities shift. Our faith deepens. Prayer stops being a burden and becomes a source of peace. God has always desired relationship, not performance. From the beginning, He walked with humanity, not watched from a distance. Prayer restores that closeness. When we stop treating prayer as a duty and start embracing it as a relationship, faith becomes personal, trust becomes natural, and communication with God becomes real. Faith is the foundation that gives prayer its strength. Without faith, prayer becomes nothing more than sound in the air. Words may be spoken, but they carry no weight because faith is what connects the human heart to the power of God. Faith is not emotion, and it is not excitement. It is a deep inner assurance that God hears, cares, and responds according to His will. When faith is present, prayer moves beyond hope and enters confidence. Many people pray while doubting at the same time. They ask God for help, yet prepare themselves for disappointment. This inner conflict weakens prayer because faith and fear cannot rule the heart together. True faith does not mean ignoring reality. It means trusting God above visible circumstances. Faith allows prayer to rise higher than problems, higher than limitations, and higher than human understanding. Faith is built through knowing God's character. When you understand that God is faithful, loving, and unchanging, trust becomes natural. Prayer spoken with faith rests on who God is, not on how difficult the situation appears. Faith reminds the heart that God's power is not affected by time, distance, or impossibility. What is unreachable for humans remains simple for God. Faith also changes the attitude of prayer. Instead of desperation, there is expectation. Instead of anxiety, there is peace. Even before the answer arrives, the heart is settled. This is not because the problem has disappeared, but because faith has placed the problem into God's hands. Prayer filled with faith does not end in worry. It ends in rest. Many believers measure the strength of prayer by volume or repetition, but faith-filled prayer does not depend on how loud or long it is. A quiet prayer spoken with complete trust carries more power than many words spoken in doubt. Faith activates the unseen work of God. Even when nothing changes outwardly, faith continues to believe that God is moving behind the scenes. Faith grows when prayer is consistent. Each time a believer prays and remembers past faithfulness, trust deepens. Faith is strengthened by testimonies, by scripture, and by personal experiences of God's provision. Prayer becomes stronger as faith grows because the heart learns to rely on God rather than on circumstances. A faith-filled prayer also includes surrender. Faith trusts God not only for answers but for direction. It believes that God knows what is best, even when the answer is different from what was expected. This kind of faith does not demand control. It rests in the wisdom of God and remains confident in His timing. Faith protects the heart during delay. When answers take time, faith prevents discouragement. It keeps prayer alive even in silence. Faith believes that silence does not mean absence. God may be quiet, but He is never absent. Faith holds on to hope during the waiting period and refuses to give up. Through faith, prayer becomes a partnership with God's purpose. The believer does not try to force outcomes, but aligns with God's plan. Faith keeps the heart humble and obedient. Prayer becomes more than asking, it becomes trusting. When faith is active, prayer changes the person before it changes the situation. Fear weakens, doubt fades. Strength replaces heaviness. Faith-filled prayer builds inner stability that cannot be shaken by external problems. The heart becomes anchored in God's promises and remains steady regardless of results. Faith continues to pray even when progress is slow. It remains confident that God is at work and that every prayer is heard. Faith does not depend on visible proof. It depends on trust in God's word and character. Prayer empowered by faith carries endurance, peace, and quiet confidence that God is faithful. God is not impressed by long speeches or carefully arranged words. He does not measure prayer by vocabulary, volume, or length. What reaches him is sincerity. A sincere prayer comes from a heart that is honest, humble, and aware of its need for God. Many people speak beautifully in prayer, but remain unchanged because their words are disconnected from their hearts. God listens beyond sound. He listens to the intentions, motives, and truth within a person. Sincerity begins when we stop pretending in God's presence. There is no need to perform or impress. God already knows our thoughts before we speak. He knows our fears, doubts, weaknesses, and desires. When prayer becomes sincere, we stop hiding and start opening our hearts fully. We speak truthfully about our struggles and trust God with our brokenness. Many believe they must pray for a long time to be heard, but God values depth over duration. A short prayer spoken with genuine faith and honesty can touch God's heart more than hours of repeated words spoken without awareness. Sincerity gives prayer life. Without it, prayer becomes routine and loses its power to transform. Sincere prayer requires humility. It acknowledges dependence on God. It does not demand, threaten, or negotiate. It submits. When the heart bows before God in humility, prayer becomes pure. Pride complicates prayer, but humility simplifies it. God responds to the prayer of a humble heart because humility creates space for divine grace. Sincerity also means being present while praying. Many pray with distracted minds and wandering thoughts. Their mouths move, but their attention is divided. Sincere prayer calls for focus. It invites the heart and mind into unity. God values this awareness because it reflects intentional connection rather than empty repetition. When prayer is sincere, there is no fear of silence. Silence becomes part of communication. A sincere heart understands that listening is as important as speaking. In those quiet moments, the heart becomes sensitive to God's peace, guidance, and reassurance. Words decrease, but trust increases. Sincerity brings authenticity into prayer. It allows emotions to be expressed freely: joy, sorrow, gratitude, and even confusion. God is not offended by honest questions or tears. He welcomes truth because truth builds relationship. Prayer becomes real when it reflects the actual condition of the heart, not an image we try to present. Repeated words without sincerity can create emotional distance. They may fill time, but they do not build connection. Sincere prayer, however, strengthens intimacy with God. It draws the heart closer and deepens spiritual awareness. It turns prayer from an activity into an experience. God responds to sincerity because sincerity reveals faith. A sincere heart trusts God enough to be open. It believes that God is compassionate and attentive. This trust allows prayer to flow naturally without pressure or fear. Faith and sincerity work together, creating prayer that is alive and effective. Sincere prayer does not try to manipulate outcomes. It seeks alignment. It asks, listens, and surrenders. The desire is not just to receive answers, but to remain close to God. This kind of prayer may not always change circumstances immediately, but it always brings inner clarity and peace. When sincerity leads prayer, transformation begins within. The heart softens, the conscience becomes sensitive, the spirit becomes responsive. God responds not because of how much was said, but because the heart was fully engaged. True prayer is not measured by time or words, but by truth spoken from the depths of the heart. Prayer is not a tool to bend God's will toward our desires. It is a sacred process that brings our hearts into agreement with His purpose. Many people approach prayer with a list of demands, hoping God will adjust heaven to fit their plans. When answers do not come, frustration follows. This happens because prayer was misunderstood. Prayer is not about control, it is about alignment. God's will is not hidden to keep us confused. It is revealed through relationship, through understanding His nature, and through sensitivity of the heart. When prayer begins with humility, the heart becomes open to God's direction. Alignment starts when we release our own plans and choose to trust God's wisdom above our own understanding. A heart aligned with God does not resist correction. Prayer exposes motives, not just need. As we pray, God adjusts our desires. Some requests begin to fade, while others become clearer. This is not loss, it is growth. Alignment reshapes prayer so that it reflects God's purpose rather than personal preference. Many people struggle in prayer because they ask without listening. Alignment requires stillness. Listening allows the heart to recognize God's guidance. Prayer becomes a two-way connection. God speaks through peace, conviction, and insight. When the heart is quiet, God's will becomes clearer. Alignment in prayer also requires obedience. Knowing God's will without obedience creates inner conflict. Prayer strengthens obedience by bringing clarity and conviction. When the heart agrees with God's direction, prayer produces strength to walk in it. Alignment removes confusion and replaces it with confidence. When prayer aligns the heart with God, expectations change. Instead of demanding immediate outcomes, trust develops in God's timing. Delays are no longer seen as denial, but as preparation. Alignment helps the heart remain patient and peaceful, even when answers take time. Aligned prayer changes what we ask for. We begin to desire what honors God rather than what only benefits us. This shift deepens faith and maturity. Prayer stops being self-centered and becomes purpose-centered. The heart learns to value God's plan above comfort or convenience. God's will always carries peace. When prayer brings alignment, anxiety decreases. The heart senses reassurance even in uncertain situations. This peace is a confirmation that the heart is moving in harmony with God. Alignment does not always remove challenges, but it removes fear. Prayer that aligns with God's will strengthens spiritual vision. Decisions become clearer, distractions lose influence, the heart becomes focused. This clarity comes not from knowledge alone, but from relational trust built through prayer. Alignment also builds endurance. When prayer matches God's will, discouragement loses power. The believer remains steady even when progress seems slow. Confidence grows because prayer is rooted in God's purpose, not human expectation. When prayer aligns the heart with God, strength replaces struggle. The burden of forcing outcomes disappears. Trust becomes natural. Prayer becomes a place of rest, not pressure. The heart learns that God's will is not against us, but for us. God honors prayer that seeks alignment. When the heart surrenders, God leads. Prayer becomes a journey of transformation, shaping the believer into deeper faith and obedience. Alignment makes prayer effective not because it changes God, but because it changes the one who prays. Prayer deepens when the heart learns silence and surrender. Many approach prayer with urgency, filling every moment with words, afraid that silence means distance. But silence in prayer is not emptiness, it is awareness. In silence, the heart becomes attentive and the spirit becomes sensitive to God's presence. Silence removes distraction and creates space for connection. Surrender begins when control is released. Prayer becomes heavy when the heart tries to manage outcomes. Surrender shifts prayer from effort to trust. It acknowledges that God's wisdom is greater than human understanding. When surrender enters prayer, anxiety loosens its grip and peace begins to settle within. Silence allows the heart to slow down. In a busy mind, prayer becomes rushed and shallow. Silence calms internal noise and brings focus. When the heart is quiet, intentions become clear. Prayer stops being reactive and becomes intentional. Silence prepares the heart to hear rather than only speak. Many fear surrender because it feels like weakness. But surrender in prayer is strength. It takes courage to trust God fully. Surrender does not mean giving up hope. It means placing hope in God rather than in personal effort. Through surrender, prayer becomes an act of faith, not control. In silence, hidden motives surface. When words fade, the heart is exposed. Prayer reveals not only desires, but also fears and insecurities. Silence allows God to work gently within, bringing clarity and inner healing. Without silence, these deeper areas remain untouched. Surrender also teaches patience. Prayer often demands immediate answers, but surrender accepts God's timing. Patience grows when the heart trusts that delay has purpose. Surrender removes frustration and replaces it with calm endurance. Prayer continues even when answers are unseen. Silence in prayer encourages listening. God often speaks quietly through peace, impressions, and gentle direction. A surrendered heart recognizes these moments. Guidance is received not through force, but through attentiveness. Silence trains the heart to recognize God's leading. Surrender changes the posture of prayer. Instead of asking with insistence, the heart asks with openness. The question shifts from what we want to what God desires. This shift deepens relationship and builds maturity. Prayer becomes a place of learning rather than demanding. When silence and surrender come together, prayer becomes deeper and more intimate. Words become fewer, but meaning increases. The heart rests in God's presence without pressure. Faith grows quietly without strain. Surrender also removes fear of outcomes. Whether the answer is yes, no, or wait, the heart remains at peace. This freedom allows prayer to continue without disappointment. Trust becomes stable and resilient. Prayer shaped by silence and surrender changes inner attitudes. Pride softens, anxiety fades, awareness increases, the heart becomes receptive and teachable. Through this process, prayer transforms character. Silence does not disconnect prayer, it strengthens it. Surrender does not weaken faith, it deepens it. Together they draw the heart closer to God. Prayer becomes less about speaking and more about being present. In this space, faith matures, trust settles, and the heart finds rest in God's presence. True prayer always leaves a mark on the one who prays. It may not immediately change circumstances, but it steadily reshapes the heart. Many people measure prayer by visible results, yet the deepest work of prayer happens within. Transformation begins quietly, often unnoticed, as attitudes shift, thoughts mature, and emotions stabilize. Prayer is not only about receiving answers, it is about becoming aligned with God in character and spirit. When prayer is sincere and consistent, it corrects the inner world. Fear begins to lose its authority. Anxiety no longer controls decisions. The heart becomes steadier, less reactive, more trusting. This inner change is evidence that prayer is working even before external change appears. Prayer transforms perspective. Problems that once seemed overwhelming begin to shrink in the presence of God. The heart learns to see challenges through faith rather than fear. This shift in perspective does not deny difficulty, but it removes hopelessness. Prayer trains the heart to respond with wisdom instead of panic. Through prayer, patience is formed. Waiting becomes bearable because trust has deepened. The heart learns that delay is not absence. In this waiting, spiritual strength develops. Prayer teaches endurance by anchoring the soul in God rather than in outcomes. Patience becomes a sign of growth rather than weakness. Prayer also purifies intention. As prayer continues, selfish desires lose their dominance. The heart becomes more sensitive to what is right rather than what is easy. This inner adjustment reflects transformation. Prayer refines motivation and aligns desires with God's purpose. Consistent prayer builds humility. The heart recognizes its dependence on God. Pride dissolves as trust increases. A transformed heart no longer seeks control but seeks guidance. Humility becomes natural, not forced. Prayer quietly removes self-centeredness and replaces it with dependence on God. Prayer strengthens emotional stability. While emotions may rise and fall, the heart remains anchored. Stress loses its grip, anger softens, resentment fades. Prayer creates a safe place where emotions are processed and healed. This emotional transformation affects daily interactions and decisions. As the heart transforms, behavior follows. Choices become wiser, words become gentler, reactions become thoughtful. This change is not self-produced but prayer-formed. Prayer reshapes conduct by reshaping the heart. Prayer also develops spiritual sensitivity. The heart becomes more aware of right and wrong, direction and warning. Discernment grows through intimacy with God. This awareness guides daily life and protects the believer from harmful paths. Transformation includes sharpened spiritual perception. A transformed heart desires prayer, not as duty but as necessity. Prayer becomes a source of strength rather than obligation. The inner change causes prayer to continue naturally. Consistency flows from desire, not pressure. Prayer-centered transformation impacts relationships. Forgiveness becomes possible. Understanding deepens. Compassion increases. The heart becomes softer toward others. This outward change reflects the inner work of prayer. True prayer does not leave the believer the same. It shifts inner priorities, builds resilience, and deepens faith. Over time, prayer shapes identity and strengthens spiritual foundation. The greatest proof of effective prayer is not only answered requests, but a transformed life rooted in faith and trust in God.